Vampire. The word invokes images of dark castles, coffins, the mountains of Eastern Europe. You know, Dracula, Lost Boys, maybe even Twilight if that's your kind of thing. Of course, such creatures do not exist, dwelling only in the realms of dark fantasies. Or do they? The two tales I'm about to relate to you may well give you pause for thought. No castles here, no coffins, no forests or cemeteries. It were the summer of 1970, the town of Winsford, Cheshire. A 19-year-old girl named Judith had gone to the doctors complaining of flu-like symptoms. You know, weakness, lethargy, that kind of thing. After a brief examination, the GP concurred that it was indeed flu, wrote her a prescription, advised bed rest, and sent her on her way. A week later, she returns. Her condition has visibly deteriorated. What's more, bruise-like purple contusions have appeared on her neck and breasts. The doctor dismissed these as love bites, and concluded that she'd probably contracted a form of glandular fever. Once again, he made out the relevant prescription and sent her home. But Judith's condition continued to worsen. Concerned for her daughter's health, the girl's mother practically frog-marched her back to the doctors. She explained to the GP that in addition to Judith's existing ailments, she'd also been waking in the night screaming in terror, ranting and raving about a dark figure attacking her while she slept. Feeling this were a bit beyond his expertise, the GP referred Judith to a psychiatrist named Dr. Dwellingwood. The account she gave to the psychiatrist is somewhat disturbing, to say the least. Around midnight, she would feel a dark and sinister presence enter her room. At the foot of her bed would appear a tall dark figure with piercing eyes. Though a fearful presence, she described the figure as being strangely attractive. The entity, once it had made its presence felt, would then slide beneath the covers and, apply itself to her, shall we say, kissing her on the neck with ice-cold lips. Intrigued and somewhat concerned that Judith was in fact relating a case of domestic abuse, Dwellingwood inquired as to whether any male friends or relatives lived in the house. But Judith assured the psychiatrist that no other male lived there, except a 6-year-old brother Graham, who, like most kids his age, had little or no interest in girls. Her dad, sadly, had died several years previous. Dwellingwood then went on to ask if her nightly visitor seemed in any way familiar, to which Judith replied yes. The figure closely resembled a Hungarian art student named Laszlo Wardog. The artist had not long moved into the area and was staying in a boarding house in Judith's neighbourhood. Now, strange as it may sound, this made perfect sense to Dwellingwood. He concluded that it was likely that Laszlo, manifesting in Judith's dreams, was simply due to the fact that she had likely encountered him during the day, in some fleeting capacity. As such, the night terrors were probably a combination of subconscious desire and fever dreams brought on by Judith's illness. Open and shut case? Well, no. By some strange coincidence, another girl from Judith's neighbourhood was referred into Dwellingwood's care. Zora was a little younger than Judith, 16 at the time. She too were experiencing the same symptoms, bruising located specifically on the neck and breasts, feelings of lethargy, and night terrors. And whose name do you reckon cropped up? That's right, Laszlo Wardog. Seemed to Dwellingwood this were a little too uncanny to be mere coincidence, and breaking with conventional protocol, decided to pay the young artist a visit. Laszlo was exactly as the girls had described. Tall, 6 foot odd, dark-skinned, and handsome. But there was something about him that made the psychiatrist uneasy. Not wanting to beat about the bush, Dwerringwood out and out told the artist that he was the bogeyman that were haunting the dreams of two of his female patients. On hearing this, Laszlo became agitated, for some reason unable to maintain eye contact with Dwerringwood. He shrugged and said simply, "Girls are crazy." Now, the attic room the young artists were staying in were also doubling up as his studio, canvases propped up on easels and various states of completion, art supplies strewn everywhere. As Laszlo was in the process of getting his paints ready, the psychiatrist noticed something a bit bizarre. Propped up against the wall were two completed portraits. Their subjects had a disturbing resemblance to Zara and Judith. "Who modelled for these?" he asked Laszlo. This got the artist's eccles up, and he replied brusquely, "I paint them from imagination." There was something dangerous in his tone that put the psychiatrist on edge. So he thanked the artist for his time and turned to leave. Just as he were walking out the door, Ordog turned to him and in a sinister voice asked, "What do you think of the girl's stories?" "I don't know," replied Dwerringwood. "All very strange, I know, eerie even, but as we know, things can always get stranger, as Dwerringwood was soon to find out. On arriving home that evening, he found his cat lifeless on the doorstep. With no clue as to the cause of death, he took it to the vet, who was also unable to ascertain the cause of the poor creature's untimely demise. That same night, 3 more incidents were to occur that would go some way to convincing Dwerringwood that he was being assailed by unnatural forces. The first occurred whilst he were watching the late night news. There was a sudden loud crack. The mirror above his fireplace had split in two. The heat. A hairline crack that had gone unnoticed, maybe. The psychiatrist grasped for an explanation. Finding none, he decided to turn in. As he were halfway up the stairs, he saw a dark man-shaped shadow on the top step. It were only there for a split second, but Dwerringwood was certain of what he saw. There was something familiar about the shape that invoked the form of Laszlo. Surely not. Surely it was just the stress of the day, tiredness, overwork. But the third event, now, that would prove more difficult to explain. Around 3 a.m, Dwerringwood's wife, Glynis, woke up screaming. Hands, ice-cold hands, clutching at my throat, squeezing the life from me, she told her husband. Now, what you must remember is first and foremost, Dwerringwood was a man of reason. It were his job, after all, to order the irrational abyss that is the human subconscious. But to him, there seemed to be no explaining his recent experiences. Maybe that's why the following day he decided to take a more traditional approach. He went out and purchased 3 small silver crucifixes and 2 Bibles. He gave these to Zara and Judith, keeping the 3rd crucifix for himself, and instructed them to wear the small crosses while they slept and keep the Bible by their bedside. As it goes, this seems to have done the trick. Things quickly returned to normal. The night terrors ceased, and the girls regained their vigour. But one final harrowing incident were to set the psychiatrist on a path of confrontation with Laszlo. Dwerringwood was settling down to sleep when he got this uneasy feeling that someone or something was standing by his bedside. He felt a cold chill on his neck, and a familiar voice, seething with hatred, rasped into his ear. "One day, I'll snap your neck." The following morning, Bible in hand, the psychiatrist made his way to Ordog's lodgings, determined to end things for good. However, he were to discover the artist had left in the night, without a word, leaving no forwarding address. Now I know what you're thinking. Well, that sounds like a load of far-fetched oakum. Well, to you, I say, consider the next tale that takes place not 20 miles down the road in the city of Stoke-on-Trent in Staffordshire. Fast forward 2 years to a dark and rainy night in November 1972. A young police officer by the name of John Pye has been called to number 3 The Villas, a boarding house for Polish migrants owned by Mrs. Rosevich. She is concerned as one of her tenants, a Mr. Demetrius Mikakure, a 56-year-old pottery worker, has not been seen for a number of days. The door to his room is locked, and Mrs. Rosevich fears that Mikakure has done himself a mischief. Demetrius had lived in Stoke for 25 years. He'd been displaced from his homeland during the German occupation in World War II, where he'd witnessed firsthand the deprivations of the Nazi regime, losing most of his family to its cruelty. As you can imagine, this had left its mark on the poor man's sanity. Now, on arriving at the premises and finding Demetrius's door to be locked, Constable Pye asked Mrs. Rosevich permission to break it down. He shouldered the door open to find the room in total darkness. Mikakure had a distrust of electricity due to an accident he'd had some months previously, and as such had removed the bulb from the ceiling rose. Luckily, Pye had his trusty torch with him. Shining it about the room, he revealed a scene from a nightmare. The walls of the room were proliferated with crucifixes and religious icons. Scattered about the floor, there were large piles of salt and bottles of urine mixed with salt, along with bags. Guess what they were filled with? Salt. Mrs. Rosevich explained that Demetrius had an intense phobia of vampires, and by all appearances the potworker had turned a small room into a veritable fortress against him. Finally, the constable's torch turned to a small bed. In it were the body of Mr. Mikakure. There were no apparent cause of death. Seemed he'd died in his sleep. Wanting to let more light in the room, and most likely air it out, the young officer decided to open a window. That's when he found something very peculiar. On the windowsill, beneath an upturned bowl, there were a cake of human excreta, mushed together with cloves of garlic. It was as if Mikakure had been attempting to keep somewhat out. Due to the strange circumstances in which Demetrius were found, the coroner and Mr. Fred Hales of Hartshill Coroner's Office ordered an inquest into the pottery worker's death. It were found that Mr. Mikakure had died from asphyxiation, caused by choking on, of all things, a pickled onion. Now, as you might well imagine, a case of this nature would have a way of sticking with a person, and so it did with Constable Pye. Since finding Mr. Mikakure, he'd done quite a bit of research on vampire lore, taking out every book on the subject he could find from Burslem Library. So when the verdict came back that Demetrius had choked on a pickled onion, this puzzled John considerably. He remembered reading that one way to ward off a vampire was to go to sleep with a clove of garlic in your mouth. With this in mind, and knowing Fred Hales were a stickler for details, he called up the coroner's office, explained his findings, and suggested that they take another look at the assumed pickled onion. The second inquest commenced in February 1973, and on further analysis, the pickled onion was indeed found to be a clove of garlic. The final ruling, that in an attempt to stave off supernatural assault from a vampire, Mr. Mikakura had unintentionally asphyxiated himself on a clove of garlic. Now, one has to wonder if the two cases I've just related to you could possibly be linked, when you consider the close proximity in time and distance. Could it be that Laszlo had relocated to Stoke-on-Trent? Being an artist, it ain't too much of a stretch to consider that he may well have found employ in the city's booming pottery industry, his talents as an artist being desirable in that line of work. Could it be that this brought him into contact with Mr. Mikakura, who saw him for what he truly was? One has to wonder. But as you all well know, vampires don't exist, do they? One last thing. In 1991, a young lady moved into an house in Winsford. She was woken one night by a chill that seemed to come out of thin air. She looked up at the ceiling, and there, staring down at her, was the form of a black-clad man, with intense, burning eyes. Understandably terrified, she hid beneath the covers. When she looked again, the figure were gone. As it turns out, the house she'd moved into was the very same house Judith had lived in all those years ago. Had Laszlo returned? I'll leave you to ponder that one. Course, I'm always more than happy to hear your theories. Right, as always, £1 a pint for the house special. Pool and jukebox free till closing. Snacks available at the bar. Maybe avoid the pickled onions though. I'll be seeing you. Have a good 'un.